Batman: Rise of Sin Tzu was once again developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published by Ubisoft. Released 2 years after Batman Vengeance on October 16, 2003, this game is the sequel to that game, although if you've played Vengeance and Sin Tzu and didn't realize that, I wouldn't blame you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The game also features the same look as the new Batman animated series, and much like the animated series did for Harley Quinn, is the origin for the character known as Sin Tzu. But unlike Harley, Sin Tzu has had less than favorable or even memorable moments in the pantheon of Batman's rogues. He was created by Jim Lee, the guy probably most responsible, although Chris Claremont deserves his kudos too, for the surge in the X-Men's popularity in the late 90s due to his awesome redesigns, and of course the animated series which featured Gambit, another character of his. Sin Tzu, however, is just kind of bland, and that's really disappointing coming from Jim Lee. There's nothing remarkable about this new character. In a game that has a villain like Clayface, for example, who stands out for being this abomination, Sin Tzu just comes across as uninteresting from a visual standpoint, and quite honestly, a little stereotypical, and that goes double for his goons. Plot-wise, he's also kind of boring. The whole game revolves around him waging a secret war against Batman, with Commissioner Gordon not spilling the details to Batman about him being moved to Arkham Asylum due to swearing an oath of secrecy due to national security. You know what? In other words, we needed the plot to move along, so he ain't talking. It makes the Commissioner kind of unlikable for a good chunk of the game. The game treats Sin Tzu like they would a villain with more stature, ignoring origin, with only a brief mention that he was an Asian warlord, and just outright announcing to have this alleged history with Batman that audibly made me laugh because of how jarring it was, and how quickly Batman deduced that he was the culprit behind all the schemes going on. It's borderline Buzz Lightyear blaming Zurg for everything that goes bad. It's just not good.
If national security is involved, then we're dealing with a foreign criminal. Given the military precision of his planning, it can only be one man. Sin Tzu, warlord of Asia.
I can neither confirm nor deny it, Batman.
Disappointing villain and story aside, the music for this game upon starting it really excited me. For about 2 months now, I've been mentioning how these superhero games based off of their animated series fail to use any of the themes associated with them, and for once, this game actually has a rendition of the Danny Elfman theme. Finally! After watching the intro cutscene with Batman honoring his parents at Crime Alley, the game begins and...
On slow nights, I come over to Crime Alley. Keeps my skills sharp. Some call it purgatory. I call it practice.
I have several questions.
So, yeah, to say Tonal Shift would be a complete understatement. I don't think in my lifetime that a Batman game based off of the animated series would have you starting on Crime Alley, essentially ground zero for Batman, with funk rock, but here we are? The game is also a beat-em-up, which again to my point earlier, if you were of the opinion that this isn't a sequel to Vengeance, I can understand that point of view because holy moly, this is about as far as you can get from both the tone and atmosphere that Vengeance had built up. Truthfully, I don't know if this helps or hurts the game, but I do suspect that the decision to go the beat-em-up route is probably the main reason why the plot for this game is just so lackluster, so take that as you will. And let me get this out of the way. I don't think the music for this game is bad per se. In fact, given the game style, it sort of fits in a weird way. But when you start off with your rendition of Elfman's theme for your Batman game, that's called setting a tone. So to go the complete opposite direction of that is about as sharp of a whiplash you could possibly give someone audibly. The animated series cast does return in this game as well, and they do fine for what they're tasked to do, but Batman in this game just does not feel like Batman. If you like Batman spouting off one-liners, well, this may be for you. For me, it kind of got old relatively fast. As a game, however, Rise of Sin Tzu is a fairly average brawler. Its main appeal is being able to play through the game as the Bat family, although for this review I strictly played as Batman. You can also do it cooperatively with another player laying the smackdown on Gotham's deplorables, and this I feel is probably the better way to play this game because playing it alone was not nearly as enjoyable for me, and we'll break those reasons down in a few. You start off with standard combos of the punching and kicking variety, batarangs, a block button, a roll button, and a taunt. You can also do a jump punch and even have some charge attacks, which serves to be one of the ways to get enemies off of you if you get yourself surrounded and need to clear some space. The way to do it, however, is to fill up your combo meter underneath your health bar to the max, and then hold a corresponding button down for whatever attack you choose to do. You can continually spam these charge attacks until the meter depletes itself. The way to fill the meter back up, however, is by doing combos, and the more the number stacks and how creative you are with your comboing, the more the meter gains. It also works double for point gaining, meaning how efficient you are at continuing your strings and how high the style points climb, indicated by the flashes of occasional words that appear on the screen, starting at fair and ending at perfect, will also count toward your point multiplier by the end of the level. The better you do, the more points you gain, in which you can redeem them for a variety of other moves and even gadgets to make your progress through the rest of the game a smidge easier. All the moves are well animated and feel good to execute with decent sound design. The only issue I have with the combat is that occasionally your character's tracking will just suddenly stop. A lot of the time you'll roll your way over to an enemy in an effort to hit them, only to just wildly swing in the air before they end up socking you in the face and making you look like a total jabroni. The batarang is also incredibly frustrating too, because enemies in this game love throwing projectiles at you, and if there's something that they can throw at you, they're going to throw it at you no matter what. So naturally, as Batman, you'll want to smack the guy with a batarang to drop whatever gimmick they're holding and not worry about getting off screen by a projectile. The problem, however, is that for whatever reason, the game will always prioritize objects on the ground like explosive oil drums or toolboxes or whatever, rather than the enemy holding an object, leading to one of two things. You either blow yourself up, or you take out a random object on the ground and the guy throws the gimmick at you anyway. You can't win with this system, and it's incredibly frustrating because you can't manually target who you want to throw the batarang at. It automatically goes to one of two. My advice? As soon as you're able to buy the electric batarang upgrade that allows you to hit up to 4 targets at once, do it. It makes the game infinitely more enjoyable when you're not getting pummeled by an infinite combo that comes out of nowhere because some jerk threw an item at you from off screen. With 4 acts and 3 levels in between each, you'll have plenty of time to earn just enough points for a plethora of moves, but the question of whether or not you'll want to is the one to ask. You see, this game for a beat-em-up is really long. It took me roughly about 4.5 hours to beat this game, and that's just way too long for this style of game, especially with how Ubisoft developed it. In their efforts to give you something to do, they throw in these occasional objectives of saving a number of civilians so it doesn't just always seem like you're clearing sections of enemies to move on to the next point. Unfortunately, however, that doesn't solve the issue. The only thing it does is add a timer and by proxy force player agency, meaning a lot of the times you have to race to get to these places to save these civvies, and the creative combos kind of go out the window because you need to be efficient in taking down enemies to save on time, which hurts you in the long run because you skimp out on points this way. Another problem is just how much they lean on this. It genuinely feels like every level has these timed civilian sections, and it does wear out its welcome incredibly fast, due in large part to how long some of these levels are. The general unspoken rule in beat-em-ups is that if your level takes too long to beat, your game is not fun. Pacing is critical in games like these. In order to really diversify this game, you need to occasionally add in a different mode or even objective so that wailing on enemies is not 100% of what you're doing all the time, therefore depleting player patience. It's like eating the same meal every day. Occasionally you'll want something different. This is where a game like Batman Returns, for example, really excelled at. With Batarang sections and Batmobile sections, there was enough to diversify the content to not make you feel like the game was getting monotonous. Rise of Sin Tzu does no such thing, and it's a shame really, because it really could have benefited from some levels being more mini-games than just all-out brawling arenas if you didn't want to go the route of copying games prior. The last level in particular is one of the most egregious levels in any beat-em-up I've ever played, going on for roughly 20 minutes with some of the most annoying and again stereotypical ninja enemies in the game that spam projectiles that invert your controllers if they hit you. This level is the real final boss of Rise of Sin Tzu, and if this doesn't defeat your patience, then bless you, because it nearly did mine. Speaking of bosses, the game does have quite a few. Scarecrow, Clayface, Bane, and of course the main man himself, Sin Tzu. There are others, though, that include all the villains from Vengeance, but they only make a cameo appearance in a cutscene, and hey, Ivy looks great this time around. So that's nice. The boss fights in this game range from pretty simple to kind of cryptic. Scarecrow's is a perfect example of me not knowing what in the world I even did to trigger him to come out to fight to take damage, but I did somehow after running around for what felt like forever. And then there's Clayface, who's a pretty straightforward boss fight, invulnerable until made vulnerable, and then repeat waves. Enemy variety is very basic as well. Everyone's essentially a thug, but midway throughout the game you do start to encounter specific enemy types that are color coordinated, with each color representing which attacks they're vulnerable to and which ones they'll always block. Or more projectile throwers. These guys are the worst because their entire MO is to run away from you as much as possible and chuck whatever item they have at your earliest inconvenience. Anyway, in regards to the other enemies, this does present something of a fair challenge in the game, forcing you to pay attention to which attacks you do to what enemies, but it's quickly made an afterthought once you start unlocking moves that are unblockable, and use those to open these enemies up rather than the attacks that they're weak to. Like I mentioned earlier though, once you get to Sin Tzu's goons, things kinda take a turn for the worst. His enemies are overly aggressive, particularly the claw-wielding ones who are absolutely unrelenting. They do insane damage, it can absolutely stagger you until death. And if that's not a problem, the fact that every single enemy in this faction can chuck that controller-inverting projectile is. Thankfully, you can block the projectile with the block button, but if you're in the middle of a combo or in the middle of getting stun-locked, good luck. You're better off resetting than trying to fight it out because they will overwhelm you, and the amount of time it takes for the inversion effect to wear off is quite frankly way too long. The only way to circumvent that is to defeat all the enemies in the area, but even that might come at the luxury of a few lives. The game is normally pretty good about dropping items, whether it be gadgets, health, or lives, at least on normal difficulty when you're running low, but the drop rate for these is a bit inconsistent, which given the track record with this game, pretty much sums it all up well enough. Rise of Sin Tzu is an okay beat-em-up. It's definitely a game I would recommend playing with friends, however. Playing it alone is not nearly as fun as it's cracked up to be, but teaming up with a buddy and whipping criminals into shape in any beat-em-up is a good time, and I don't see that being an issue in this game, despite my few gripes with it. And there's a bits of side content as well, with things like comic book covers to look at, concept art, and even some challenge modes that may provide you with something to look forward to, outside of the punches and kicks that this game will have you doing for 5+ hours. My advice, however, is to play the game in spurts. Do an act and call it a day with the game until the very next day. Otherwise, you'll burn yourself out and have a much more negative opinion of a game that, while not terribly offensive, doesn't have nearly enough content or variety to justify its length.